So we're going to talk about contentious politics for 2 weeks. And I wanted to set that up and get a conversation going on this topic. But maybe the best place to start is to answer the very natural question, why are we reading this concrete piece of kind of comparative historical sociology, this concrete piece of research? Why is it relevant to the philosophy of social science? And so I'd like to address that to start with. And my answer is it actually kind of derives from something which I share with Doug McAdam. This isn't something I've wound up including in the syllabus here, but I've done interviews with each of, well, a good number of sociologists, including McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley, over a period of 5 years or so. Tilley was the very first. Adam was close to the middle. And these interviews are just really outstanding. They're all on YouTube. You can get to them through my webpage. And they, in each case, you learn a whole lot from each of these brilliant sociologists. But one of the questions I asked McAdam was, I said, Doug, some people probably think that the study of contentious politics is interesting, but very specialized. It's just one small piece of sociology. But I have the impression that you think it is very different from that it's actually, in some sense, equivalent to all of sociology. And McAdam answered saying, yes, I do think that. I do think that it's not that it's the only topic that's of interest, but that there are very few topics in sociology where the tools of contentious politics, the tools of analysis of contentious politics are mostly irrelevant. And what that is really to say is that the sociological processes, the causation, the ways in which social and bureaucratic and institutional change proceeds, that it has a lot in common with contentious politics, with mobilization, with forming coalitions, with conflicting interests across time and space. And so here's one reason why I think it's relevant for us to start with contentious politics, start kind of looking in a little bit of detail at a theory and a series of examples of analysis in the field of contentious politics. And that is that these tools and these sociological, this exercise of sociological imagination, that it's really very broadly relevant, relevant to many different sociological research projects. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is you have probably noticed that I am advocating for us to at least consider an actor-centered approach to sociology, to the social sciences, to political science, an actor-centered approach. And this book does just a marvelous job, it seems to me, a marvelous job of taking an actor-centered approach and approaching a big, complicated, historically and geographically extended problem and treating it from an actor-centered approach. So in other words, in a way, I think we get a much better understanding of what an actor-centered approach to sociology is by seeing it in action, seeing the concrete empirical work that has been done. There are many different examples one could have offered. We'll see some other examples through the course of later readings in the course as well. But this is one place where we can see how an actor-centered approach can be applied in a very rich and deep, and I would say nuanced way. So that's a second reason. And here's a third reason, which kind of overlaps with these first 2 points. And it's a question about social explanation. What is a good social explanation? And we have in the history of philosophy, the history of analytic philosophy, the history of philosophy of science, there is kind of a dominant view. It was dominant for sure up through about 20 or 30 years ago. It is the view which kind of was the sequel to the Vienna Circle, to logical positivism. It is the covering law model of explanation. So to explain an outcome, you want to know why your radiator burst out in your driveway last night. You would like to explain the bursting of the radiator. And Carl Hempel and Ernest Nagel, Tom Nagel is a different philosopher, the kind of neo-positivist generation of philosophers of science for the 1960s and 70s, they had one standard answer to the question, what is a good scientific explanation? It is the hypothetico-deductive model of explanation, hypothetico-deductive model of explanation. In fact, I'll jot that down. It is the covering law model. It is the subsumption model of explanation. It's the idea that to explain a phenomenon or something, an outcome, we need to identify the general law which made it occur. The general law which made it occur and the specific circumstances that triggered the law. This is the equivalent of a blackboard or whiteboard on Zoom. So to explain an outcome according to this covering law model, we need to identify the general law which necessitated its occurrence and the specific occurrence of the specific circumstances which triggered the law. So in the case of the exploded car, the radiator, it was filled with water. By stupid oversight, I filled it with distilled water, which freezes at 0 degrees centigrade. The temperature last night, this is a boundary condition, was negative 15 degrees centigrade. A general fact about frozen water is that it expands. Ice occupies more volume than water. And it is irresistible. It has a very powerful ability to expand. And the rigidity of the iron or steel of the radiator is thus and so. Take those facts and the general law, when distilled water is chilled to negative 15 degrees centigrade, it freezes to ice and expands. That's the general law. And then we can derive the bursting of the radiator. I said elevator. Suddenly you're going to be thinking about elevators blowing up in tall buildings or something, how awful that would be. Okay, so that's the covering law model. And it had huge persuasive power in the natural sciences. In my view, and this was my view going back to my first exposure to one of those neo-positivist philosophers of science, Israel Scheffler. He was one of the two supervisors of my dissertation on Marx, but he was also a person who was an advocate of this, of the covering law model. And in talking about explanation with Israel Scheffler, I realized this makes no sense at all in the social world. I wasn't quite clear why it didn't make any sense. Anybody want to give me one really good reason why maybe the covering law model doesn't seem very appropriate to the social world? Anybody have a quick idea about why the covering law model is not a very good approach to explanation in the social world? Laws of nature. Ice expands. Boom. Now, how about the social world? Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that you mentioned last week was, or 2 weeks ago, was about social systems not being like closed systems in the same way that physics explanations work, because the system is closed and we have very regular laws without a lot of contingencies and variability. So the social world doesn't work quite like that. We have lots of different contingencies
Yes.
that are harder to explain.
Okay. So yes, and that's essentially what I would say as well, that the social world is not subject to strict laws of behavior. That view was not widely accepted in the kind of first 50 years of the development of sociology as a discipline. And in fact, going back to Durkheim and Comte, I guess in French it's called Comte, there was the idea we really must discover the general laws of sociological development and causation. That's the fundamental objective of sociology. Discover those laws. It's going to be hard work because they're not obvious, but we need to find them. We need to find those general laws of sociological dynamics. And at least the point of view that I would like to advocate for you, but it's one which is so clearly and strongly expressed in Dynamics of Contention. That's why we're starting there. No, there are no such laws. There are no such governing laws of social change. And therefore, the hypothetico-deductive model of explanation is a non-starter. We don't have the option of explaining social outcomes by discovering exceptionless or even statistical laws of behavior under which outcomes can be subsumed. Now, several of you, Jun Chao, I know you are a quantitatively minded sociologist, and you and I would agree that there are regularities in the social world, and they're interesting regularities. But what I'm putting forward here is kind of an ontological claim. The laws of gravitation have a powerful necessity concerning the movement of massive objects. That natural necessity of the laws of gravitation is not to be found in the laws of infant mortality. So we have the fact that infant mortality has different levels in Sri Lanka and India and the United States and Brazil. So there are regularities. Those national health systems have different characteristic levels of infant mortality. But we couldn't ever imagine that the law of infant mortality or the regularity of infant mortality is a governing law. It is rather what I would like to call a phenomenal regularity. It emerges from features of the social, economic, institutional, and health arrangements of those different kind of national contexts. So they're regularities, all right, but they're not governing regularities. And therefore, to make the argument that Sao Paulo has a super high infant mortality rate, we explain that by saying Brazil has a super high infant mortality rate. No, that's not a good explanation. It's not a causal explanation. We need to do better than that. That's in a thumbnail, I'm basically putting it forward that philosophers of the social science for the past 25 years or so have been unhappy with the idea that explanation should take the form of hypothetico-deductive derivations of outcomes from underlying general laws of social dynamics. So the covering law doesn't help us much. The subsumption model of explanation is not a strong model of explanation. Well, we might say, oh my gosh, I'm now without tools. I don't have a way of providing explanations. If you've taken away the one and only kind of explanation which survived in the philosophy of science, then we're left with nothing. Well, we actually do have an alternative. It is causal explanation based on the discovery of causal mechanisms. Causal explanation based on the discovery of causal mechanisms. So what I'm suggesting to you is, and it's kind of a general proposition for us to be entertaining as we go through the whole course, that social explanations can be offered for social outcomes, but they derive not from generalizations about social workings, rather they derive from the discovery of a wide range of concrete social mechanisms. So if we would like to know, for example, why do boycotts often fail? So that's a regularity. Boycotts often fail. Why do they often fail? Well, we already have a good basis for explaining that, but maybe somebody could explain what the mechanism is. What is the mechanism that would account for the fact that even strongly motivated boycotts nonetheless often fail? Anybody have a quick explanation of that fact? So Amazon, a lot of us feel Amazon has too much economic power and doesn't treat its workers well. We should stop using Amazon. Let's have a boycott of Amazon. Why does a boycott of Amazon have a relatively low probability of success?
Probably because the boycott is expected to end within some time horizon. You can't do enough economic damage to get shareholders to adjust their behavior or pressure Amazon to adjust their behavior.
Okay, but why is that? Why would the boycott not be expected to go on for 100 years if necessary?
Like the attention span of the average consumer.
Okay, that's a possibility. Any other kind of related points that anybody would make the observation?
I remember like there was like a Washington Post article about this in the last month, and I'm trying to remember what it said. I think it was something about the difference between like PR pressure and financial pressure, and that boycotts are supposed to do one, but ineffectively do the other, or something about that distinction. I'm trying to remember it.
Okay, so that's what I like about both of your ideas is you're both looking for a mechanism to do what though? A mechanism which would lead increasing numbers of people to abandon their statement, I'm going to boycott Amazon, come and join me. In other words, the move from individual commitment to collective action. That's what we're trying to explain. And we actually have now seen a very simple rational choice or kind of rational intentional explanation for why boycotts would often collapse. And that is that each person can reason, in the end, if I order a pair of shoes from Amazon, yes or no, that's not going to affect whether or not this boycott succeeds. One person as a defector from the boycott is not going to affect the outcome. And then you might say, well, if everyone did that, then the boycott will fail. And I will now say, I being the rational maximizer, I will say, well, if it's going to fail, then what kind of idiot do you take me for to make the sacrifice, buy my sneakers at a place where I might get COVID rather than having it delivered? Why would I take on that private cost if it's going to fail? So on either scenario, either it will succeed, in which case my contribution is unneeded, or it will fail, in which case there's no purpose to my contribution. Either way, I should be a free rider. And maybe also write letters to the editor and blog and tweet and say, boycott Amazon, they're really bad people. And in other words, I might make the investment of trying to persuade other people to contribute, but kind of a rational consideration of costs and public benefits Well, all I'm saying is this is a mechanism for explaining the failure of boycott. Chandler, you gave a more, in a sense, a more interesting explanation about the shadow of the future, where I might have even a degree of willingness to collaborate for a while, but that, that willingness you were kind of hypothesizing falls off over time. And therefore, as more and more people fall off, more and more people make the decision not to participate. We don't need to try to come to a conclusion, this is how boycotts actually work. The only point I'm getting at is this is a causal mechanism which can explain the failure of a boycott. And it doesn't require that we have a general law. Boycotts always collapse, or boycotts always survive, or boycotts which are supported by strong, fervent motivation always surprise. No, we don't need generalizations of those sorts at all. Instead, we have this mechanism which depends on an analysis of the decision-making situation of each of the potential people involved. I'm going to stop for a minute because, Margot, a few minutes ago, you had a different comment you wanted to make.
Yeah, I had a question. Sort of like a very broad level question. I'm wondering if there's like anyone in sociology. I guess I'm wondering sort of how universal the rejection of like the Hempel style model of explanation is. Is there anyone in sociology or like adjacent fields who is kind of sympathetic towards that, or is the whole field kind of not on board with that? Because I guess I can sort of, I don't know, maybe because I don't know anything about sociology generally, but I can see like this intuitive pull towards thinking that the social system should work just like a physical system, just on a bigger scale. Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering like where the tides are.
So there's
in contemporary sociology.
That really breaks down into two different, and they're both interesting questions. I'll have a hard time keeping them both in mind. But first of all, there's a big piece of sociology which is premised on a quantitative methodology, and which believes that essentially to validate a claim about economic recession or about racial discrimination or about wage gaps between men and women in the labor force, that any of those sociologically interesting facts must be explained on the basis of large-scale quantitative data, which is analogous to covering law explanations. But there is a group of, there's one interpretation of that approach which says, we're not actually that interested in explanation. What we're interested in is discovering these regularities. In some sense, we would like to know why men and women in the labor force demonstrate an income gap. And we will resolve that question by discovering as much as we can about what the circumstances are of women in the labor force and men in the labor force. In other words, we will give you a quantitative profile of the two populations, which will then account for the differences. In other words, how much can we explain on the basis of what we know about the characteristics of the individuals? That would be to kind of, it would not be to endorse the covering law explanation. It wouldn't be to say, we now know the cause. What is the most common thing which quantitative or a statistician says about causation? The most common thing, correlation does not imply causation. And it's almost like we have to kind of dig in deeper. Why does correlation not imply causation? Well, because it's possible that the things which are correlated are the common result of a third cause. So the fact that my phone rings every time we begin our class at 6 p.m., it's not that the beginning of the class causes the phone to ring, it's that the class begins at 6 and some dopey business is programmed to call me at 6:05, I guess. That seems to be the explanation for that particular correlation. But that's why the correlation doesn't imply causation. It's because they are collateral effects of a common cause. Doesn't mean there isn't a cause. What it means instead is the things which are correlated, one does not cause the other. In other words, there are specific reasons why we say correlation does not imply causation. But the more difficult challenge is the fact that most sociological correlations are kind of weak. So if if we were talking about racial disparities in employment, we might find that there are a dozen factors which appear to be relevant, and then we would ask the question: is one of these the cause, or are they all causally relevant? In other words, we've got a whole bunch of difficult issues to resolve. But that brings me to I said that there are two different topics to be considered here. Quantitative sociologists who have thought carefully about causation have come around to the idea the best quantitative argument for causation is one where we can stipulate or we can discover a causal mechanism. So if we were to say that I'm a little stymied to find a good example, but that differential employment statistics for Black teenagers and white teenagers is explained by driving distance from jobs from population. I don't know. I'm just making something up. It's not a credible hypothesis, probably. And let's say we have some statistical evidence for this, that white teenagers are on average closer to jobs than Black teenagers. We would feel more secure in thinking that that is a causally relevant explanation if there were actually a mechanism which could account for it. What I was trying to work this example around to is the lack of public transportation in Detroit. The fact that you can't get from Detroit to the fancy malls in Oakland County, that would be my mechanism. I couldn't quite work it into the statistics that I was trying to make up on the fly. But if we had a set of data which kind of shed some light on differential outcomes for Black teenagers and white teenagers, and then the mechanism in question was white teenagers can easily get to the jobs, Black teenagers can't because of the structure of public transportation. That would be to enhance the quality, basically the quality of the causal inference which is being made. Junqiao, I'm sure that didn't satisfy you, because I know from previous conversation that you have quite a bit of knowledge about kind of causal reasoning based on statistical data sets. If you want to think about it for a second, well, Chandler also was going to make a comment. But if you wanted to make a comment that kind of helped with this, you'd be more than welcome to. Chandler, why don't you start, and then Junqiao can.
Yeah, I was actually, Junqiao could probably jump on this. So the idea about causation, that's, constantly talked about in economics as well as quantitative sociology, I'm sure. What about situations where you have like instrumental variables, where you sort of have this random selection, this quasi-random? So the best example of this was a study where that I remember, where basically the author used draft cards that were basically based on the people's birthday, and basically randomly gave people, some people were sent to the military drafted, some people weren't. And then he found there was a relationship between going to the military and wages. Well, there isn't a clear causal explanation, but there seems to be evidence there for causation because you have random assignment. Would that be, would the absence of a social mechanism, I don't know, make that sort of evidence less? Because in my field, we kind of talk about that's evidence of some sort of causation, even though there is no mechanism involved that I can really think of.
Right. So it's it seems like a pretty difficult problem for. Let's say the claim is that there's a strong correlation between one set of characteristics and an outcome. And so we put forward the statistical basis for that statement, but then we say in the very next breath, and by the way, there's no imaginable causal mechanism that could link the first set of characteristics to the outcome. It's pretty hard to take that seriously as a causal a causal judgment. I mean, it's a little bit like what sports commentators do. You know, whenever this basketball player is shooting from a particular place on the court, he generally hits the three-pointer. These are spurious correlations, not valid quantitative causal findings. Or on the other hand, if you did feel confident that the finding is causal, then you seem to be sort of committed to the idea that there is some causal mechanism. It's currently unknown, but there is some causal mechanism. It's interesting that smoking and cancer was kind of in that situation in the 1950s, that there was very strong correlational evidence that exposure to smoking caused emphysema and lung cancer and so forth. But the precise mechanism was not yet known. We might say that it's too strong a requirement that you must specify the mechanism, but we might say it's a stronger causal claim if we can specify, at least in some level of detail, we can specify what the mechanism might look like. I didn't really mean to go too far down this road. It's a very interesting and very important topic, but I'm not sure how much further I can take it today. Jianchao, did you want to add anything to it? So quantitative causal relationships.
Sure. From my point of view, I think so. I can observe. So it's kind of like I'm more familiar with the social stratification literature in sociology. So this is a like highly quant subfield within sociology. But like in recent years, I have seen like in 1980s and 1970s, there used to be most scholars in this field, in stratification field, well, they are much of them will be like spending a lot of time doing what is called path analysis, like just adding a lot of variables into the model and trying to decide the relationship between each variable. So the direct effect of X and direct effect of your father's education on your education, and indirect effect of father's education on your current job and on your first job. So that's what used to be what quant sociologists did a lot in the 1980s, but that is no longer the case now. So nowadays, I think it is true. Like nobody in our field will think like it is possible to derive a thorough model of like explanation of inequality just based on the data. So, but on the other hand, we can observe some like opposite movement in the data science and big data movement. So data science and big data movements, their sole goal is to make predictions. So to make perfect predictions. So they don't care too much about the why the prediction is correct. But I just think the data-driven approach toward of data science, they face the same question that if we don't understand theoretically, we don't know the mechanism between all of these independent variables and dependent variables, we cannot be so confident that the statistical regularities can be stable enough across different contexts. So that's a major problem we have for a data-driven approach. So Chandler make a very interesting point, like instrumental variable. So actually, when we apply an instrumental variable approach, we are assuming we have a very strong assumption of causal like relationship. We assume the instrumental variable is not the true causal. It's not the true cause, right? We will assume it's only like X leads is correlated with instrumental variable. And instrumental variable itself is not correlated with Y. So that's how instrumental variable approach work. So yeah, I do think like within the field of social science, the mainstream quant scholar will nowadays will definitely not think like, okay, we can find a true explanation through adding variables into the model. That's no longer the case now.
Mm-hmm. So the simplest kind of quantitative reasoning, I suppose, or at least this is one simple kind of quantitative reasoning, it is multiple regression analysis. And so in this case, we've got a characteristic, let's say lifetime earnings. And then we've got a data set of individuals. We've got, let's say, 10,000 individuals who've been selected at random. And then we, I'm just making it all up. We have characteristics of the individuals, including race, gender, family characteristics, married, single, education levels. We've got a whole bunch of characteristics. And then multiple regression analysis allows us to determine that some of those characteristics do not covary at all with the outcome. So some of those properties just get dropped. They're not causally relevant. Other characteristics have a weight, and it may be a strong weight. So race may be a strong weight, and attending community college versus four-year university may also have a strong weight, but living in the suburbs versus living in the countryside may have a weak weight. And what does having a strong weight or a weak weight mean? It means how much of the variance is explained by that particular variable. Is that a fair, kind of quick description of what multiple regression? Now we've got something that maybe sounds kind of causal, kind of explanatory. We've explained an outcome, lifetime earnings, as a joint result of a whole bunch of variables. Let's say 10 variables have turned out to be significant. And we also have weights assigned to those variables. So we're basically saying lifetime earnings are affected by race, education, parents' income, where you live, and something else, education opportunity. Is that a full causal explanation of lifetime earnings? Probably not. Is it at all explanatory? It probably is somewhat explanatory. Is race, is that a fundamental variable, or is it, is there a whole bunch of background institutional facts that race is actually representing, or is kind of a flag for? In other words, maybe I should just bracket at this point and say, we're raising, and I meant to raise this question, I'm not positive I meant to raise it about quantitative reasoning specifically, but the question we're raising is about causal explanation. And what I'm putting forward is that for the explanation of contentious politics, let's start there, statistical explanation is not particularly helpful because there aren't general laws, there aren't really strong regularities about civil wars and riots and rebellions and the examples of contentious action which we can think of. There aren't strong regularities, but in place of a regularity-based explanation or a large data set explanation, we have another possibility. The other possibility is that we can try to uncover what are the causal mechanisms which are commonly implicated, commonly discovered in particular episodes. Episodes is that's the term that Taro, McAdam, and Tilley introduced. In multiple episodes, what are some recurring causal mechanisms which arise and which then get concatenated in different combinations in different instances, but then we can account for. So that's the model of explanation which they're offering. They're suggesting that the episode of the 1968 Chicago Convention, which turned violent and which involved both the war in Vietnam, the recent assassination of Martin Luther King, so race politics, civil rights politics, and anti-war politics, the organization of the New Left. There were lots of factors involved. How should we explain, we're back on secure ground here, how should we explain the occurrence of the 1968 Democratic Convention riot? Well, we shouldn't explain it by coming up with a multiple regression involving a whole bunch of riots. Rather, we should explain it as a contingent sequence of mechanisms interacting in a dynamic way. If the New Left, I guess it was SDS, is that the left organization? John Dillinger was the criminal. Abby Rubin, the Chicago 7, are these familiar names to you all? Steal This Book, is that a familiar title to you? Don't trust anyone older than 30, a famous slogan for you. These were the slogans, these were the manifestations of the radical left at the time of 1968. But the Chicago 7, they were thought to be the leaders of the insurrection. They were put on trial. It was kind of a crazy time of American politics. But the point that Tilley, McAdam, and Taro would make is that complicated event was a contingent sequence of strategic interactions which occurred involving Democratic Party leaders, the contenders representing the anti-war movement who were in the streets, and the mayor of the city of Chicago, John Daley, who was, just a kind of beat them till they bleed kind of mayor, use a lot of force if necessary. And the net result was something not intended probably by anyone. Certainly the Democratic Party did not intend for this level of violence to occur. It's not exactly clear that the left preferred this level of violence. And the mayor this was not in his interest in the end, though he certainly provoked a lot of the violence. But the point is that Tilley, McAdam, and Taro they don't deal with this particular instance, but what I'm kind of suggesting is we can kind of think through, it's one complex episode, and then we can try to give an account of the episode, and by discovery of the claims which are being made, the demands which are being made, the strategies and counter strategies which are being put forward by the antagonists. In this case, it was a complex set of antagonists, the police and the mayor, the Democratic Party and their interests and intentions about running the convention, and the New Left and many thousands of demonstrators who were assembling in Chicago. So those were the three protagonists. And then it seems very credible to me anyway, that there was no, kind of predictable law-governed outcome which necessarily happened. You could easily imagine, had the I think they call it the L in Chicago, the elevated subway, had the L broken down at a critical moment and a whole group of demonstrators got stuck in the suburbs where they were crashing, that's the term that was used in those days, crashing in the suburbs, couldn't get to the mobilization point, that would be a contingency which could have affected the outcome. And Tilly, McAdam, and Taro are completely aware of the role that contingent actions, contingent events have in the unfolding of an event. But at the same time, the forces of repression, the strategies which were chosen by Mayor Daley and then by the police, that's a complex set of strategies which were chosen. The strategies which were chosen by the claimants, by the protesters, that's a different set of strategies. In other words, we can kind of work out what this sequence of events was. It's almost like a chess game, and then led to an outcome, which was not a desirable outcome for any of the parties. Yeah, Jiwen.
Yeah, I have a question about the causal. So in some case, although this causal is not related to the final outcome, but people still believe this causal affected the outcome. So I'm wondering whether they have two mechanisms. One is the fact, the fact level, this causal lead to the outcome, and another is make the people to believe this causal affect the outcome. So because although this this reason, this is the actual reason to lead the outcome, but if the people don't believe, so it's useless. So I think the more important things, whether is to make people believe this cause is a main factor to affect the outcome. So I'm wondering, I'm a little confused. Is there have two mechanisms or they are same mechanism? So that's my question.
So, well, let's take a step back and notice that, well, first of all, we're dealing with a number of different political actors. So Rennie Davis, that was one of the names of the leaders. So let's say that he was the leader. Rennie Davis leads the SDS challenge. So he is the lead challenger. There's the organization, Students for a Democratic Society. That's the organization. Rennie Davis is the leader. We've got that configuration. We've got the police and the mayor, a second configuration. And then we've got the political leadership of the Democratic National Committee or whatever. Your distinction is between what are the factual events which occur on the ground and what are the beliefs which various people have. But actually one of the main, the important theoretical innovations which McAdam makes in material you read several weeks ago is that those two things can't be separated. So McAdam, do you remember you read the introduction to his book about the civil rights movement? In a sense, it would have been more appropriate to read it for this week than 3 weeks ago, but it was one of the things you read for the very first session. He points out that actors, political actors, they are purposive. They do things for a reason, but they do it in a way which is culturally framed or ideologically framed or normatively framed. In other words, we can't eliminate the role of culture and belief and ideology, but that is part and parcel of the actor's motivations. So the response I'm making to your question is that what people believe is actually causally relevant to what they do. And if the Students for Democratic Society, the followers of the Students for Democratic Society didn't believe 2 or 3 important facts, One is we do have the ability to push the Democratic Convention to do certain things it doesn't want to do. So we can succeed. They need to believe that. They need to believe the war in Vietnam is a moral atrocity, and it justifies a lot of sacrifice on our part. So they need to have kind of a normative belief and a belief about efficacy. If they believe those things, and if they are also a part of an organization which has an ability to reach out to them, in Hong Kong, Elun, I'd be really curious what you might have to say about, I think you've told us that you've studied Hong Kong mobilization, but crowds don't show up just spontaneously. Someone says, let there be a crowd, and there is a crowd. Instead, organizations create crowds. They mobilize crowds. They communicate to crowds. So the organization has to do certain kinds of things. All of that is part and parcel of what Tilly and McAdam and Taro are talking about when they talk about the dynamics of contention. They're talking about framing. Framing is, it's cultural, it's beliefs, it's moral convictions, it's ideologies, but it's how do I frame my own action in these particular circumstances? Let's say I live downstate in Illinois, and I've been very active in the Southern Illinois University chapter of the Students for Democratic Society, and we've gotten the call, in a week, SDS will be protesting in Chicago. We can prevail. Come and help us. Come and support us. Well, will people come or not? The suggestion is they will come if they're strongly enough motivated. But what would make them strongly enough motivated? It requires this framing stuff. It requires what do they believe and what do they care about and what are they motivated by? And it's one thing to come from Evanston. So if you're in the Northwestern University chapter of SDS, you just hop on the L and come on over. You may not know this, but Carbondale, Illinois is 350 miles from Chicago. It's forever, and you can't get there by, any convenient way. You gotta get your hippie van all loaded up with gear, and you gotta drive 2 days to get there. So it's a big investment to go and support your brothers and sisters in Grant Park in Chicago. Why would you do that? Well, you wouldn't do it if you hadn't been strongly prepared. During Arab Spring, there was the thought that Twitter created Arab Spring. And what would that mean? It would mean Twitter communicated a bunch of ideas to a bunch of people who then showed up in Tahrir Square ready to start the revolution. But it was then pointed out, no, Twitter does certain things very well, but creating strong affinities is not one of the things it does very well. If you got a tweet in Carbondale, Illinois that said, 3 days from now, major demonstration in Chicago, Grant Park, be there or be square, you would only come if you were, kind of predisposed, if you were already a strong and committed follower, not, committed to, I'll give my life for the movement, but committed enough to say, yeah, I'll put my sleeping bag in my pal's hippie van, and we'll drive up there and we'll join this demonstration. Even though we know that mayor is he's a wild card, and there may be some violence up there, but we'll take a football helmet or something. In other words, we'll prepare ourselves a little bit. In other words, that's the whole point about the framing stuff. It's also why Arab Spring, you probably can't make sense of it as a Twitter revolution. It doesn't actually make sense that tens of thousands of Egyptian young people would come out simply because they got the tweet that said, it's time to overthrow our dictator. There's got to be more to it than that. There has to be organization of some sort. And therefore what? Well, and therefore we need to be investigators like Taro, Tilly, and McAdam. What were the forms of organization? What were the forms of knowledge? What were the forms of framing? What was the sense of injustice which people shared? How would you try to mobilize people to come and have, let's ask you a concrete question. Suppose that January 6th had prevailed before there was a riot, and Vice President Pence had said, with the authority vested in me, I hereby declare the November election was a fraud, and Donald Trump is president of the United States. Hear, hear. So an anti-democratic gesture has been made. What would it take to have massive demonstrations all over the country, do you think, against this coup? There's a certain amount of polling which suggests that young people actually don't care that much about democracy. I don't know if that's true of this particular group, but what would it take to bring hundreds of thousands, let's say millions of people in Chicago and New Orleans and Houston and Minneapolis and many other places out protesting the overturning of the 2020 election? Would it just be spontaneous, or would it take something more than that? That's my basic question.
I feel like it would have to come from some network of organizations. Like, I would probably do it through the union, the graduate student union.
Good. So you've got a good start to this question. How could you imagine it actually starting? A massive public pro-democracy, completely peaceful, by the way. I'm not talking about Proud Boys killing policemen type actions. I'm talking about peaceful demonstrations rejecting a Donald Trump coup. How could it happen? Lucas, what were you going to say?
Well, I don't mean to derail your question with another question, but I was sort of thinking about like the BLM protest that took place last summer. And like, I guess, I didn't actively protest, but I have quite a few friends who did. And when I think about like how they found out, it was really like they either saw it on the news first, so there's already a prior demonstration, or like there were just groups on Facebook that were like, we're gonna hold an active demonstration now. And like, so I don't think Facebook is responsible, but I'm wondering, like, there has to be some group of people who get together, or some kind of already pre-established organization, or people who sort of very quickly mobilize to create an organization or network, or use pre-existing networks to then like turn them into like activist networks.
So Chandler referred to one thing, which is kind of a medium-sized social organization, political organization, a union. So a union might be one basis of mobilization. Lucas, you're referring to another kind of organization, which is a social network, a group of people who know each other, know something about their commitments to racial justice, have a certain degree of willingness to be social activists. It's one thing to be one person. I don't know if you've seen this in Ann Arbor, but occasionally you see a demonstration of one person in front of the post office. And I forgot what he's demonstrating about. It's a little bit odd to be one demonstrator, but BLM wasn't like that. BLM was large numbers of people, and trying to figure out what was the mechanism which permitted the assembly of large numbers of people. Clearly communication, through social media, that clearly was an important social mechanism. The networks that you're referring to, Lucas, people who kind of antecedently know each other and are kind of understand that this is a commitment we share. We're not racists, and we're not willing to have police killing Black teenagers, and it's gone on long enough, and we're willing to stand up. that's another good example of a social mechanism which might be invoked. Emily, a minute ago, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I remember last summer going to a seminar online, obviously, with one of the original BLM founders, and she said that, you know, a lot of the narrative about that there was this sudden demonstrations, that these had appeared out of nowhere, that they hadn't been the same kind of protests in the face of previous slaughterings, really undermined the work, the huge amount of work that organizers had been doing over a really long period of time. And that, you know, there was huge amounts of small work being done for a very long time to change people's minds, so that when something happened, people would say enough is enough, that process of organizing often gets rendered invisible by mass protests.
So that actually comes back to Jiwen's point also, that by helping, let's say, younger people become more vigilantly anti-racist, that takes work to go from being, I don't know, kind of quietly, passively anti-racist to being, this really matters a lot to me, and I want to be part of a change in American society. That's a change of mentality. It's a change of the way of thinking about the world. It's a change of framing. And I think that, Emily, your point is correct, that there were lots of organizations, grassroots organizations, which were working on anti-racism, working on trying to build social consensus against police brutality and against the kind of chronic racism of our society. And then on top of that, I just have to imagine that in many cities, there were specific organizations who were willing to stand up and say, okay, we're ready. We're like the Graduate Student Association. We're ready to call our members to, in other words, small organizations or medium-sized organizations which were willing to step forward and then do their own recruiting and their own kind of bringing out a membership in support of a movement. Again, I guess I don't really know in any detail enough about how BLM got to be so massively successful, but it is exactly the kind of question that McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley are saying we need to investigate if we want to understand that movement. Going back 8 or 10 years to Occupy Wall Street, basically the same kind of question arises. How did Occupy Wall Street become Occupy Minneapolis, Occupy Ann Arbor, Occupy, I don't know if they had an Occupy Houston, Occupy Birmingham, Alabama, probably not. But how did that movement go from being, I don't know, 1,000 people in Battery Square Park to being a national movement, which had a certain amount of staying power? Well, it had to be more than just there was an occasional newspaper article. There had to be leaders and organizers and advocates who were, helping to make it happen. So where was I going with this? It is that it's that the Dynamics of Contention is a book which is kind of centrally located enough for us to really kind of get a grip on a particular style of explanation in the social sciences, a particular style of research. Notice we've already asked a bunch of interesting research questions about BLM and about a hypothetical movement, restore democracy movement in this country. But during the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen in other countries exactly. In Burma, for example, we've seen exactly the mobilization of citizens who care about their own democracy being mobilized. And I think that kind of a central premise of McAdam, Tarrow, Tilley is that it's rare anyway that a mass movement would just spring out of news, out of shared information. There's something bad going on. Rather, there needs to be preparation, there needs to be organization, there needs to be get out the vote, but in this case, get out the demonstration type of engagement. And then coming back to the topic of social mechanisms, Chandler, again, I like the example you gave of the union, because this is actually one of the mechanisms which McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley highlight, and it's a mechanism of, I guess, what do they call it? It's not collaboration exactly, but it's extending of relationships across organizations. So the graduate student, GEO, Graduate Employee Organization, GEO was established for a purpose, which was to defend the economic and work lives of graduate instructors. But by engaging itself in BLM support, it's basically broadening its mission, at least for that period of time, and also broadening its relationships. So it's working also with maybe teachers unions in Detroit, or maybe the Teamsters Union in Lansing. In other words, it's engaging in a mechanism which Tarrow, Tilley, and McAdam see as recurring everywhere in the Mau Mau examples, and in El Salvador, and in basically every episode that they see organizations which are then reaching out and forming alliances with other organizations, and then broadening their ability to mobilize, to activate, to get individuals to be involved. Let's talk about the mechanism of mobilization for a second. Remember when we did was it just last week we kind of did a critique of rational choice theory? It seems so long ago. It was just last week. But there's a very simplistic actor-centered approach to collective action theory, which depends entirely on a rational choice analysis of individuals. So individuals are considered in terms of the interests which they have and their desire to maximize their well-being. And so they may support a rent strike if they can somehow be persuaded that their support will be directly linked to their not getting kicked out of their house, not getting evicted, having rent control sustained, whatever. In other words, that there needs to be a direct economic benefit to the participant. And it has been demonstrated, it's almost impossible to mobilize in support of a collective good based on purely self-interested economic rationale. And why is that? Well, it's because most collective goods are also public goods. They're goods which, if achieved, are available to the whole population, whether they contributed or not. Chandler and Junshai, you're probably familiar with the idea of a club good. Is that a familiar idea to either of you? A club good? So a public good is a good like clean air, which if it's available to anyone, is available to everyone. That's a public good. A private good is buying a tomato at Plum Market. I buy the super expensive, super organic tomato at Plum Market, and I've got a private tomato to eat. That's a private good. A club good is something else. Anybody, this is
non-rivalrous, but is excludable.
Yeah, exactly. So if Michigan Radio were a subscription service, then it would be, I think that would technically then qualify as a club good. If you had to have a decoder ring in order to listen to Michigan Radio, then you would contribute in order to listen to Michigan Radio, because if you don't contribute, if you don't, quote, pay your fair share, then you don't get the benefit. You can be excluded from the benefit, and therefore, well, what happens to donation rates? What would you predict would happen if Michigan Radio There are two different questions. Michigan Radio, let's say, has a 400,000 person audience, and 100,000 people actually provide an annual gift of, let's say, $100. So right now, 400,000 people listen, 300,000 are free riders, 100,000 pay. What do you think would happen if Michigan Radio became a club good or a subscription service? What would happen to the 400,000 to start with? Would its total audience increase, decrease, or remain the same, do you think? Seems kind of logical it would decrease because you have to pay. And if you're not a very committed listener, then you'll say, well, there's a lot of other free channels, I'm not going to pay. And therefore, they're no longer a listener. So the 400,000 probably goes down a lot. On the other hand, some of those people probably will pay because they actually are technical free riders. They really enjoy the benefit, but they're free riding on the benefit, and they'll be willing to pay some amount. So the 100,000 in donors probably goes up a bit, and the total audience probably goes down a bit. So that's a rational choice analysis of collective action. The central premise of McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley is that collective action and contentious politics are not just about economic rationality. That's the reason why it's so important that McAdam, in his introduction to the book about the civil rights movement, says, I've made the cultural turn. I've made the cultural turn. I understand that engagement in the civil rights struggle is purposive, it is intentional, it's goal-directed, but it is also embedded in cultural assumptions which are motivational. And the cultural framing which I do in my perception of race relations in Birmingham, Alabama, that cultural framing is different if I'm Black than if I'm white. But as a white supporter of racial equality, the cultural assumptions which I bring also are motivational for me. So the point is that we can't understand political motivation in a purely economic, in the sense of pure economic rationality. And that's a really important contribution of this book. So actually, the quote, I do have a quote here, the affective and cognitive come together to shape political perceptions. This is from page, it must be, this is from the introduction, actually. This is from the McAdam introduction. The affective, what is affective? That's the emotional, basically, or the value-oriented motivation that I have. The affective and the cognitive, my assessment of what my interests are, come together to shape the two perceptions of what I should do. So in other words, from the very start, they undertake a view of political action, which says that political action is framed by assumptions about identity, assumptions about what kind of society I want to live in, assumptions about my relationships and my obligations to other people. All of those things contribute to my political motivation. And in a very concrete way, that means that I will be ready to be mobilized to some extent. And then mobilization is the next topic. So what is mobilization? I think I pulled out a quote. Here's another quote from the McAdam introduction, again, that you read 2 or 3 weeks ago, but you still have it. Quoting from the introduction, given the motivational importance I attach to the protection of one's most intimate and primary attachments, the appropriation of a highly salient collective embedding, church, neighborhood, union, can be expected to carry with it a very different default option than the one animating the free rider dilemma. This is their response, his response to the free rider view that says collective action will always fail or almost always fail. And what he's saying is there is motivational importance attached to the protection of one's most intimate and primary attachments. So, for example, if I am a white professional person in Birmingham in 1956 who has come to see the racism of Alabama is religiously unacceptable to me. Let's just say that's where it comes from for me. It's not true for me, but you know, that white lawyer that I'm thinking of, he has come to a conviction: racism is religiously unacceptable to me, and therefore I am now religiously committed to be an anti-racist. That's the protection of one's most intimate and primary attachment. And I am now committed not just to my own self-interest, but to my church, my neighborhood, my organization, my population, that those attachments lead me to do things which, as a purely, narrowly speaking, economically rational agent, I would not do. And McAdam believes this completely changes the environment. It changes the environment of choice, because it means that individuals will be motivated to take actions which are costly for themselves. So some of the really horrible from the 1950s, early 60s, the horrible violence against young Black men, freedom riders, for example, civil rights workers, but also white and Jewish civil rights workers who showed up and who knew that they were taking on risks and who then were killed. Why did they do those things? Well, they didn't do it out of economic rationality. They also didn't do it out of just blindness. They did it purposefully. They made choices. They made intentional choices, but they did it in this more complicated way, the motivational importance that they attached to the protection of one's most intimate and primary attachments, like not being a racist. So that bigger view, that kind of culturally framed view of motivation, that's a really important part of their conception of the actor, which now brings us to the other important noun or verb, mobilization, or to mobilize. So mobilization is the process by which an extended group of individuals come to be, through some mechanism or other, come to be activated to support collective action. And we've talked about now several examples. Those hippie types from Carbondale, Illinois, who hopped in their hippie van, in my little story a couple minutes ago, to go to Chicago, they were being mobilized. They were joining a mobilization. They answered the call. They didn't do it just completely spontaneously. They were asked by other people they trusted in this case, I was kind of imagining the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, people that they had met and trusted had asked them to come. They then had, in a sense, to make a choice. Their moms and dads were probably, if they were consulted at all, were probably saying, that's ridiculous. Chicago, we hate Chicago anyway. So it's a bad place and violence happens there. You shouldn't go, don't go. So that's mom and dad speaking. But the young mobilized person has made his or her own decision, purposefully, intentionally, deliberately, to be mobilized. Lucas.
A question to sort of like against this background of maybe individual autonomy, so to speak, of an individual actor. Can actors be compelled or forced to mobilization? And if so, is that then still mobilization? Like I'm thinking like in the Vietnam War, sort of a mandatory draft. Is that a mobilization of individual actors?
Right. I think that doesn't fit their definition. So their definition is to be mobilized is to be brought to a place where one voluntarily joins a movement, joins a process of resistance or demonstration or some kind of political action. So something which is legally required is, I don't think that would fall under the category of mobilization. There's a nice diagram actually that I had meant to show you a few minutes ago, which you've seen, but let's see if I can find it quickly. And there we go. So this is actually, this appears in both the dynamics of contention, but it also appears essentially in the same, it looks almost exactly the same in McAdam's introduction to the book about the civil rights movement. But what I really like about this this diagram, you see it, right? You see the shared screen? Yeah, good. So you've got the challenging group on the bottom and the challenged, the elite actor, the state, the Democratic Party, whatever. And now we have this complex process of interaction and strategic interaction. But we've got the interpretive process, that's the cultural part. So the interpretive process is, it's essentially what's going on in Chicago is really important right now. That's one reading. I'm talking about 1968. It's really important for the future of our movement or for bringing the war in Vietnam to an end, really important. And then it's got a lot of collateral stuff about how bad the war in Vietnam is. Or possibly what's going on in Chicago, stuff like that happens, not too important. I'll read about it in the newspaper when it comes out next time. That would be a different interpretation. Then we have in kind of classic, well, the current version of social conflict theory, we have kind of searching around for opportunities and threats. So what are the opportunities which exist to resist or to express opposition to the state or the elite actors whom you are challenging? So the idea is that a social movement emerges when there is motivation on the part of potential followers who can be mobilized, who can be led, who can identify threats and opportunities. The opportunity might be, as simple as, well, there's a network of places we can stay if we go to Chicago. That's a resource that we have available to us. And so it's not difficult. We can drive to Chicago and then we can just pick up an address and go and stay with these people. So that's an opportunity which lowers the cost or lowers the obstacle to participating. Then we have the idea of the appropriation of existing organizational and collective identities. So our Carbondale young person or a couple of people, their collective identity is as student, as Illinois person from the southern part of the state, but also as radical, got some long hair, already burned a draft card, belonged to the Carbondale chapter of the Students for a Democratic Society. So I've got a collective identity. And then we have these ideas of innovative collective action, innovative on both sides. And if we were doing a detailed study of the Chicago Democratic Convention and riot, we'd want to know what were the innovations and what came out of the repertoire of kind of just standard stuff that organizations do when they're having a demonstration. And then finally we have sustained contention. So what I like about the diagram is the fact that it's so interactive. We have kind of thrust and counter thrust, movement and counter movement by the various parties involved. And as I mentioned before, Chicago was even more complicated because there were three actors, not just two. There was the radical movement, there was the Democratic Party, and then there was also, the forces of order. That's what Marx called them in the 18th Brumaire. the mayor, the police, and so forth. And each of those groups, each of those actors had a different set of strategies that were available, resources that were available. David Graeber, I think we mentioned David Graeber once before, but David Graeber, who wrote the book about debt, and he wrote also about Occupy. In fact, some people believe that some of the innovations which occurred in the Occupy Wall Street movement, that David Graeber was actually the origin of those innovations. I think maybe we talked about that on a previous time. But the big innovation there was Graeber, the way Graeber describes it, there's some book that he wrote about this. It's kind of an ethnography of the anarchist involvement in Occupy. But he describes getting the news that there was a demonstration going on in Battery Square Park, and his anarchist friends, and he felt that they really ought to go down and, you know, express their own support for that. And so they do, but then they have the idea, these other people are imagining this is just a one-day demonstration. Why would we leave though? So the innovation was the idea of staying and of occupying Battery Square Park and refusing to leave. And that, of course, turned out to be a major innovation, a major change, and one which kind of swept the country.
This will just be, hopefully y'all can see that fine.
Yep.
This will just be a sort of, Dan already went into most of the interesting points from this chapter over the past hour and a half. So this might be just a little bit of a refresher. So this is the third chapter of Dynamics of Contention by McAdam, Tarot, and Tilley. Also going to look at sort of some of the more key items from the first two chapters and just a few slides that are very important in sort of the way that they have designed their ideology. So sitting at the sort of core mechanism, so to speak. Sorry, I find that funny. We have sort of three different terms here. We have mechanisms, processes, and episodes, which are at play. And a mechanism would be a delimited class of events that alter relations among specific or specified sets of elements in identical or closely similar ways over a variety of situations. As is their definition, these are essentially going to be the most fundamental parts of, I guess the fundamental study of this book seems to be about mechanisms and how they're at play. What kinds of mechanisms cause different kinds of episodes, and sort of a cultural comparison, cross comparison of various mechanisms. We have different kinds of mechanisms. I have some of their examples listed in a little sub bullet point here, or hyphen. There's environmental mechanisms like resource depletion, enhancement, think about competition. You can have cognitive mechanisms such as a collective perception, the way that individual social actors perceive events, or how events are perceived on a larger scale or portrayed. And then relational mechanisms, one that they cover is brokerage, which I suppose is probably also an economic concept, but my economics is not, I'm certainly no economic expert. They define brokerage as a connection between social sites, groups, and individuals. So I assume this is just sort of the relationship between individuals. And processes is essentially going to be a kind of mechanism, or a number of mechanisms, I suppose. They give the definition: regular sequences of such mechanisms that produce similar, generally more complex and contingent transformations of those elements. And they define this as a sort of continuum between a mechanism and a process. So brokerage can be either a mechanism, a family of mechanisms, or a process. They mention that in their book, they'll consider brokerage just one mechanism. But it seems inherently sort of clear that something like democratization of a nation involves several mechanisms at play. And then episodes will be the sort of actual objects of study in sociology, I assume. At least in the focus point of this book is looking at several different episodes. And they define an episode as a continuous streams of contention, including collective claims making that bear on the other party's interests. And these always involve at least two processes and sometimes more. I'd wager mostly more. And so these can be any kinds of processes of mobilization, identity shift, polarization, etc. On this next side, they introduce, I believe it's in the first chapter. It's either in the first or second chapter. This is the sort of the classic social agenda that we've spoken about a little bit. And it's a very static representation of social movement, of contentious interaction. We start with sort of social change here. Can you guys see my cursor here, or is that a yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, good. Great. So yeah, you see, we sort of have social change here, and then we have three various different processes. You can have opportunity and threat by social actors or governments, mobilizing structures or framing processes, and somehow all three of these lead to contentious interaction. But that seems like a rather incomplete and static diagram. And actually the diagram that Dan showed earlier is sitting here on slide 5. And we'll get to that in a second. But the idea is sort of that, well, it seems that something like framing processes, or the way that individual actors or the media or other kind of meso level infrastructure organizations frame something, that might lead to a shift in opportunity or a shift in threat, a change in understanding, a change in mobilization maybe. And so it seems like these processes are going to be interacting with one another in a way that allows contentious interaction to continually be sort of defined and redefined, and it's not going to be such a static process. These are exactly the weaknesses that McAdam, Taro, and Tilly mention in the second chapter. Actually, this might be, I believe, at the beginning of the third chapter. They list sort of a host of various problems with this classical social movement agenda. I'll list them real short. Contentious episodes don't exactly have definable starts and stops. And that seems kind of obvious. It's how do we really say at what point BLM protests have started, or at what point they've stopped? It seems kind of weak to me to say that Black Lives Matter has gone away, so to speak, because the big demonstration events in the summer of 2020 are gone. And so we have contentious, they have here mobilization of actors, demobilization of others, and transformations of one action into other actions makes contentious episodes sort of difficult to exactly define. Then they have that contentious interaction transforms routine social relations within communities and structures that have often thought to have shaped such action. Reification and individualization of actors block the way to dynamic and interactive accounts of contentious action. And it imagines the state as a static force. They write kind of funnily, producing opportunities, awaiting mobilization, but not participating in contention, which just doesn't seem inherently true. They write that the state plays a very important role in defining threats and opportunities, in mobilizing existing and creating new resources, and can transform the course of interaction. And so this is where we get this diagram. It's the one that Dan showed was a little bit more pretty, I think. I'm not so sure what this place in history thing is. This is actually written in the textbook when I had it. I don't know if Dan, is this true?
Let me take a look at that again.
I saw that written in this textbook. I just took a picture of the diagram from the textbook, but in it, I didn't erase what was already written in it.
Right.
They drew
Yeah,
this
I'm
arrow
not
here.
entirely sure what it's supposed to mean, except that, I mean, if it is simply the threats and opportunities are historically specific, then that makes sense to me. You know, that they're contingent, they occur at a certain time, but not at other times.
Yeah. I don't know how it was written in the book when I had it, but yeah, so we get they suggest a much more dynamic model, where we see that sort of all these kinds of processes like cognitive framing effects or or what's mentioned here, opportunity or threat or mobilization structures, these kinds of things can interact with each other and create new resources. They can restrict resources, things like that. So in the third chapter, this is sort of the meat. They want to understand how exactly are they building their case, their dynamics of contention. They want to broaden the scope from what has been historically done. So they want to shift their analysis towards a smaller scale and look at the causal mechanisms that recur in different scenarios with different aggregate consequences in different combinations. Important thing that they stress here is that it's important to find the relationship between several causal mechanisms, but this doesn't necessitate that, or rather I should say, it doesn't suffice that a causal mechanism will result in the same exact outcome. There's a whole host of variables between these causal mechanisms and the way that they interact with each other. And so it just wouldn't be enough to say that the same causal mechanisms, because they're implicated in two various episodes, meaning that this episodes will have the same exact outcome. And so they strive to set a analysis of contentious phenomena that vary significantly in period, place, scale, duration, unity, political regime, types of actors, and forms of contention. They have this nice little chart, the distribution of episodes by geography and conventionally assigned forms of contention. I believe this is all 15 episodes that are discussed throughout the frame of the entire book. And you can see just how geographically diverse and interestingly, what kinds of forms of contentions that they identify in each episode. And I believe this will probably play a large part in later parts of the book in understanding how do these episodes relate to each other on basis of geography and these various forces of contention at play. If I forgot to mention, but if anyone ever has questions, you can just kind of stop. I can't see anyone. So, yeah. So, continuing broadening the scope, they have two important axes that they use when sort of examining episodes. And these are state of capacity and extent of democracy. Two very interesting ideas. They define state capacity as the degree of control state agents exercise over persons, activities, and resources within their government's territorial jurisdiction. And they have a whole host of things here how it can be changed or how it can be increased. They write there's 4 complementary processes. The first would be replacement of indirect by direct rule. The second would be penetration by central states of geographic peripheries. The third would be standardization of state practices and identities. And the fourth would be instrumentation, which is growth in the means of carrying out intended policies. And then we have the extent of democracy of a nation. They define that as regimes of protected consultation and they judge it based off 4 qualities. The first would be breadth of polity membership. The second would be equality of polity membership. The third is strength of collective consultation among polity members in respect to government personnel, policy, and resources. And the fourth is protection of polity members by governmental agents. And the idea behind building such a taxonomy would be examining the role of contentious politics in trajectories of polity shift. So how and to what extent are different forms and outcomes of contention necessary to transform polities from low capacity to high state capacity, or from non-democracy to democracy?
May I jump in, Lucas,
Please, yes.
and ask something? So it seems like in terms of like their extent of democracy, for example, it seems like some of these dimensions are somewhat, I can imagine in some cases, mutually conflictual. So for example, the strength of collective consultation among the polity members, you could imagine a situation where collective strength is so strong that it's able to overwhelm the protection provided by governmental agents. So it seems like increasing in one dimension could shrink it in other dimensions. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or what they're trying to get at, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had similar thoughts too about exactly how the scale works, because I don't want to risk saying and potentially reveal ignorance, but when looking at this graph, it appears it might be linear. I don't mean this graph is a linear depiction, rather, but they have their capacity as either high or low, and extent of democracy is low or high. And so it seems to me like I don't know, what the relative qualifications are, how one is going to affect the fourth or the second or the third, and how they actually end up holistically defining a level for that.
Can I add something here as well? Because I was also thinking about this and thinking about their way of using cases in pairs and pairing things and using them for comparison. I'm thinking back to what we were talking about earlier this evening, about the idea that we're not really trying to uncover generalizable laws. It seems to me that a lot of this, it doesn't really matter that when one thing increases, probably something else increases, and it doesn't really matter that the scale is nonlinear. In fact, in many ways, it doesn't really matter that they've put them on a map at all, in my view. I'll try and defend it. What's more interesting is that if they're thinking about trying to organize things so they can pick out cases that contrast in different ways, and they've got some potential axes for thinking about how to identify things that contrast in different ways. Because when you do that, and then when you make multiple comparisons and these layers of comparisons, each one adds more to your to the data that you have. One of the things we talk about in I sent Margot a paper about this earlier, because she was asking about people who look for causal mechanisms versus people who are looking for kind of big statistical patterns. One of the things that we talk about in really small n studies, and this would be a small n study, right? There are what, 8 or 15 cases or something. It's a relatively small n study. Is what we're really interested in with each case or with each comparison or whatever it is that we're doing, is what new information are we getting from it? What is it telling us theoretically that the previous case wasn't able to tell us? Is it bringing up new questions? If it stops bringing up new questions, then we've really kind of exhausted what we needed to look at. And so I think here what's happening, or for me what's happening when I look at this, is we're thinking of some potential ways and some potential things that might be going on which might affect how our cases work, so that we can draw up sets of comparisons which will hopefully give us different kinds of information. But that doesn't mean anything about that. There's nothing implied about statistical causation or linearity or anything in trying to draw up these cases. You just have to draw them up somehow. You have to think about which comparisons are going to work better and which ones aren't going to work. which ones might give you more information or might give you different information to other ones in order to start going through that process. Well, that's how I think about it anyway. I don't know if Dan wants to add anything.
I actually had a somewhat different thought, and that is that, Lucas, you were sort of getting at this point, these two dimensions don't seem to be independent of each other. Or maybe Chandler, you were saying this.
Chandler's original thought, yeah.
They're not independent. If you have super high capacity, then you would expect low democracy. As Lucas was presenting, I was kind of drawing out a 2x2 table. Can we classify cases into high capacity, high democracy, low capacity, high democracy, low capacity, high democracy? I think I screwed that one up. And then low capacity, low democracy. I didn't get the four possible combinations. And the question is whether all of those cells would actually, are there examples of political situations illustrating each of the four cells? Low capacity, low democracy, that seems very possible, where maybe clans are, rather than the state, they're very repressive and they control behavior, let's say. So low capacity, low democracy makes sense. High capacity, high democracy, I'm not sure what they would say about that, because that's the situation that Chandler was wondering about. Stalinism was a high capacity state and a super low democracy state. But I suppose you might say, you could imagine a British state which had high capacity within its constitutional scope, but its constitutional scope also secured, strongly established democratic rights, let's say. That would be high in that case. So what I'm actually, I guess several of us now are questioning whether these are actually axes. Could you go back to the graph?
Yeah. Is this one you mean, or
no,
this one here?
The one that you say, yeah, this one, yeah. Because you are kind of right that they seem to be, kind of on from low to high. I guess there are some examples of high capacity, low democracy, no examples of high democracy, low capacity, which actually seems, I think we could easily think of instances in that quadrant. In other words, the graph doesn't seem to illuminate this distinction too well. It's a valid question to ask, is this actually a good way of segmenting a set of cases? Emily, that's kind of you were saying that we don't even need to segment the cases. I think they're using this distinction to differentiate the cases, but is that a useful exercise or not? That's all by itself actually an interesting philosophy of social science question, because it sometimes happens that social scientists make use of formalisms which are not aiding in the analysis or in the explanation. And this could fall in that category.
I don't want to speak for Emily, but if I understood her correctly, I'm thinking maybe, it could be the case that McAdam, Taro, and Tilly want to demonstrate that these two dimensions might help us sort of organize the kinds of mechanisms. If we look back at this table, like the kinds of mechanisms that might show up in various episodes. So whether or not low state capacity versus high democratization, if that will lend itself to a particular set of mechanisms or processes of like to appear in these various episodes. Is that sort of your idea, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I thought what was really interesting about what they said about this was that they were specifically choosing things that were really different because they wanted to notice mechanisms that were the same in really disparate cases. And they specifically critiqued previous work that had compared really closely kind of geographically linked or ideologically very linked cases. And so the idea, I think, was that they were overdoing multiple sets of these comparisons, is that they were going to identify new mechanisms as they looked at new comparisons. So the idea was that they would sort of build this set of things. And one potentially logical way of at least starting to go about that process might be to pair, two high capacity, high democracy, pair two low and low, compare a high and a low, compare a different high and a high and low the other way around, and at least start to think about which comparisons might yield new information each time by using some kind of taxonomy to help you start that process. Because otherwise what happens is you have, I don't know, 1,000 potential episodes of contentious politics to start with, and you think, well, which ones am I going to use to start this kind of comparative process? And you have they're all experts in their own, in stuff that they've done before, so that helps you sort out a bunch of things in which they already know a lot of stuff, right? So you probably use those cases, and then you think, well, what do we not have? And so this kind of taxonomy process can help you start to think about I'm really not talking about statistical sampling, but what kinds of things are going to highlight mechanisms that are coming up in different places, and you start doing that. And so I think I see it more of as a kind of thinking tool rather than a kind of something that's going to give causal weight to any kind of conclusions that are derived from it. And that's kind of how I read it. I didn't see anything come up later in chapter 4 anyway that kind of drew on this kind of taxonomic picture to help give some kind of causal weight to what they were claiming, or to explain any particular mechanisms.
If I could make one more comment that I think is relevant to Emily's comment. I think that they look at mechanisms as being kind of like common molecules of social action. Molecules in the sense that, so molecules form, kind of naturally, given the electron bonding whatnot of chemistry. H2O bonds simply, H20O doesn't bond. So H2O is kind of a natural molecule. Brokerage is a natural strategy in the sense that smart politicians, smart strategists, smart revolutionaries would immediately think, we need to hook up with some other organizations that also have some strength. Or it may be states. We're the state, we're in big trouble, big demonstrations against us, we're in Myanmar. We need the Chinese state to be, we need to get something going so they've got our back. In other words, brokerage is a very natural strategy. So the way I think of the mechanisms that they're offering, they're molecules in the sense that they're kind of straightforward solutions to problems of collective coordination and competition. And so it's not surprising that they recur in many instances. But what we don't find is that they're found in every instance, any more than H2O is found in, I don't know, it's found in bread, but it's not found in olive oil. Or every molecule doesn't appear in every food, but there are some common molecules that occur in many foods.
Yeah, polymers are a really good example of this, Dan, because if you think about like polymers, everyone will have done this at school, right? Because this is nice, simple chemistry. But you've got polymers, they contain these small little monomers that join together. But the particular sequence that you have determines the eventual kind of structure of the polymer and what it can do, and what kinds of reactions it will catalyze. It's quite a nice little metaphor.
And that's
sorry for more chemistry.
But it sounds a little bit like what they mean by processes, which is concatenation of a bunch of mechanisms. So good. Lucas, we've taken you off your game here, but you can continue if you like.
No worries. Great discussion.
Yes, yeah.
Just to close out this little PowerPoint, they end the chapter talking about exactly how they're going to compare the episodes. They mention two sort of systems of paired comparison, and I don't have formal training in statistics, I have to admit. So this is rather new to me, but I guess intuitively doesn't seem too difficult. They mention these two different strategies, one being the most different systems analysis and most similar systems analysis. Most different systems is a quantitative analysis of multiple cases selected to represent variation across a whole universe. So I suppose that would be variation between all polities, all democracies, a look at all recent wars, or etc. These kinds of processes, or I guess, I don't know whether to call these processes or contentious events. Dan, do you?
I would call
What
them categories of episodes.
categories of episodes? All right.
So civil wars, that's a kind of a category of a bunch of episodes which are different in many ways from each other. And likewise, revolutions, that groups a bunch of episodes together, and yet they're not uniform. That's their key point, is that episodes differ, and they differ even from things which are formally classified as being similar, like the Civil War in Eritrea and the Civil War in the United States. They're both called civil wars, but many processes and many mechanisms were distinct.
Right. So this that's this idea of most similar systems analyses. It's a treatment of two, or I believe there should be, or more cases to maximize comparability. And they stray from the common foundations approach because they believe that common foundations, as Dan just mentioned, you might look at two civil wars or two various cases of contentious interactions or politics, and then there might be hidden variables that will play a role in this situation's outcome. And so they instead opt to do a more kind of uncommon foundations approach. They want to look at whether similar mechanisms and processes drive changes in substantially divergent periods, places, and regimes. The idea, of course, being the identification of causal mechanisms in situated time frames would lead to a better understanding of the interaction of various forces at play. And so they take episodes as being the main point of comparison. And they want to look at the mechanisms and the processes that are within the episodes, see how they're connected, what various kinds of, or I should say, unique sequences of processes and mechanisms and how they lead to the specific outcomes of an episode. And they identify at the end of the chapter two sort of major goals. They hope to identify the mechanisms and processes that figure significantly in the episodes and then explain the major features of them. And they hope to identify the distinctive configurations of mechanisms that set episodes apart and account for the major differences among them. So it's about the unique sequences of the various mechanisms and processes, potentially also the interaction between one another, so how processes become, or I should say how mechanisms evolve into different processes, and which compound elements processes are made of. So how we get a process of democratization from X number of mechanisms in one instance, and a instance of democratization out of Y constituent mechanisms in a separate instance. And so they believe paired comparisons is going to lead itself to be the most important and powerful I hate to say mechanism in this instance, but tool really is what should be there, tool in trying to identify these broader scope mechanisms and kind of zoom out and get a bigger picture idea, as opposed to the more static classic social agenda. And then they, at the very end, they make it very clear that it is likely pretty impossible to fully comprehend just one contentious trajectory. It seems like there's maybe too many different ways in which you can classify a certain mechanism, its a process and its various constituents. It just seems like maybe several different sociologists will look at an episode and identify even more constituent elements that need to be regarded. And so they make it clear that their goal isn't to demonstrate a complete and comprehensive history of these 15 different episodes, but rather their main goal is to identify the most important causal mechanisms. That's all I got.
Great. Really nice presentation, Lucas. I don't actually, why don't you leave it up if you can?
Oh, great. Okay.
There's Emily, this is back to you, because it seems to me the idea of paired comparison no longer makes sense if there isn't a basis for pairing, the two episodes which are being linked together. And you made the point, Emily, that they're very adamant, we're not going to pair them as being most similar. But then what is the principle of selection that makes it relevant to compare Mau Mau with El Salvador, or, Occupy New York, Occupy Wall Street with Democratic Convention? There has to be some basis for pairing. Otherwise, you might just say, it's just better to take randomly 2 or 3 cases from your 15, look at them carefully, see what's similar, see what's different, then move on to another. But to call it paired comparison implies that there's a selection process which is going to shed some light. And
Or
yeah, go ahead.
Or it could imply that the important point is that you pair 2 things, and that those 2 things in their pair, whatever those 2 things are, become a case. So you're essentially looking at, whatever it is, like 8 cases instead of 16 cases, because the pair and the comparison that you get out of that pair, whatever it is, whether they're put together arbitrarily or through a kind of thought experiment, or through specifically starting to put things together and then seeing what's missing and then pairing things differently. We're talking about experts in their field, right? So these are not people who are pairing things completely at random. They're bringing some expertise to the table when they start the pairing process. But as they start to pair some, they might think, well, we really haven't got anything that compares these 2 main sort of types that are usually sociologically agreed to be very, very different. Let's try those next and see if they add anything to the data. Yes, you could say that, so I guess the interpretation of the word paired, I think, dictates whether or not it's legitimate to talk about this as paired comparison. So, you've just argued that paired might mean that there's this sort of systematic process through which we go through this pairing. And I've presented an alternative position in which the pairing is the pairing is, it's not important how you get to the pairing itself, the concept of pairing and then comparing pairs becomes the important tool of analysis. So
what do you think about this as a research topic and method? I'm interested in organizations that facilitate trade and a commercial economy. Organizations that facilitate trade and a commercial economy. So I'm going to do paired comparisons. My first comparison is Nate's hamburger joint in a push truck and Saks Fifth Avenue. I'm comparing.
Well, I'm not an expert in that particular field, so I would
Never
have
had I.
very little to no, but my point is that part of my point is that our three authors here are all world experts in their area, right? So
Right.
when they start thinking about which kind of cases are going to at least make some kind of cognitive sense to put together, even if they don't quite know what'll shake out when they pair them,
Yeah.
right? That there's some kind of, they've already done some sense making in terms of picking out, like, let's say they each bring two cases that they know really well to the table, right? So you've got 6 cases to start with, and then they start to think about, right, what is going to add to this? What could we pair this with? Let's pair two of ours together that we know really, really well as a kind of starting point. Let's see what comes out. Let's see what shakes out. That might give us some ideas next about what kind of cases that we're less familiar with we might want to start looking at in more detail.
So it's exploratory.
Some exploratory work. So that might be one way of thinking about this kind of paired approach.
It's a really interesting point, because you might say that a single case study is a good way of discovering causal mechanisms and processes. But then I think Emily's position would suggest you're not going to see the single case study so well unless you see a case which is in some way comparable, but which works differently. Then you'll see what's more distinctive about the case you're really interested in. The comparison is useful because it draws your attention to difference as well as similarity. I'm not quite sure what is interesting about it is that Tarot has a whole methodological theory about paired cases, and his theory is exactly the opposite of what is stated here. It is select the cases very carefully so that they're similar in every respect but one or two, and then see how they unfold. So his approach is literally the opposite of what's being expressed here, which is the odd thing about joint authorship, I guess. Okay, well, now that's, what's really interesting about this, Emily, is thanks to a nice presentation by Lucas, and then your observation and Chandler's observations about this method, I think we actually now have a better understanding of what the method is supposed to do and maybe what it doesn't do. So that's good. That's real learning. So thank you. Nice work, Lucas. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. If I may just quickly chime in, I thought I had remembered a very short paragraph, and indeed I found it. They have one short paragraph about their sample here of cases, about their pairing method. It's on page 75 of Dynamics of Contention. They write, "Clearly, we have not assembled a random sample of the world's contentious episodes since 1800s for examination, whatever such a sample might contain. We have instead sought out instructive contrasting chunks of contentious politics for which substantial scholarly analyses already exist. We have then fashioned paired comparisons around them, comparisons aiming to isolate key mechanisms in the context of substantial differences." That's all they have to offer.
Mhm.
So I don't know how helpful that is, but it
There's
seems like
no principle of selection beyond the fact that, again, which Emily was also kind of saying, there's a lot of expert knowledge about these cases, and they're complex enough that they warrant a comparison, basically.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that as well, Lucas, is as they point out that they're looking for cases where there's lots and lots of scholarship available. But as you said earlier, we can't understand a kind of any contentious trajectory in its entirety. And part of the reason is they're looking at historical events, right? So they're limited by documentation, by simply what's available to them. And so there's this kind of idea that by pairing them, you can spot what isn't directly, what there isn't kind of direct and obvious evidence for, and you can start then looking for stuff that you think might be there because it came up in another case that simply isn't available from the single case study method. If you think about doing a case study of a kind of a contemporary case of something, somebody can go in, they can document as they go, And then you can identify these causal mechanisms in situ. But with this kind of historical analysis, that option just isn't available to you. So I think there's something fascinating about this kind of idea of paired comparisons. And they're obviously done a lot in kind of contemporary ethnography as well. But I think with the kind of scope of what they're doing, I think it's a really fascinating methodology.
If I can quickly add to that, actually, that made me think of, I wonder also to what extent, because these are already events that have taken place and already have a set scholarship sort of literature dedicated to them, what extent missing mechanisms might actually be problematic insofar as we don't know whether those mechanisms were at play. I think of very clearly something like the Mau Mau Rebellion, where there is quite a lot of record destruction by the British on the part of this sort of the way that they set up Kenyatta's government in Kenya. There is quite a bit, and there's sort of this mass deportation of Kenyans. There was quite a lot of record damage and destruction to try and hide what was done. And so I'm wondering if a mechanism isn't present, or maybe historically, based on documentation, doesn't actually mean that such a mechanism wasn't an important process in the actual contentious politics itself.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Actually, in the interview that I did with McAdam, a sort of similar point came up. He said, we in contentious politics, we're really interested in episodes of contention. And yet, what we actually miss by focusing on episodes of contention is the many instances in which contention might have been called for, but never happened. And he kind of goes into detail about this, but also how he addresses that problem. So he said that environmental activism, local environmental activism, has gotten a lot of attention in the study of contentious politics. Why neighbors come together and protest the placement of an incinerator. That was the example that he had in mind. And the studies have all been about 10 incinerators around the country, and here are the ways in which neighborhood associations struggled, and in these cases they prevailed, and in these cases they didn't prevail. But McAdam said, we're going to try a different approach. We're going to, instead of selecting for the instances where contention occurred, we're going to select on the incinerators themselves. We're going to get a list of incinerator plans all around the country, and then see how many of those stimulated neighborhood activism. And then out of that, how many of those instances turned into successful opposition or not. In other words, it was just it's kind of related, I think, Lucas, to what you're saying. It's what's missing, basically. And what he's saying in some studies of contentious politics, including possibly these are all studies where contention actually happened. Are there other instances of colonialism, post-colonialism, where we might have expected that there would be resistance, and in fact, we got something else? That would be an interesting question. Okay, I've got 2 or 3 comments I wanted to make now that we've had this terrific presentation. And so I'm going to share my screen and put up just 3 sentences. So it's really short. We're going to stop well before, well, certainly before 9 o'clock. About a quarter of is when we'll stop. Let's see, I'm sharing screen. Now, that's the boring screen. I'll show you a better screen. Yeah, here you go. So this first highlighted sentence that you can see is, to me, a crucial sentence. It's the reason why I think this is such a terrific book and study. We make a bet on how the social world works, that big structures and sequences never repeat themselves, but result from differing combinations and sequences of mechanisms with general scope. We make a bet on how the social world works, that big structures and sequences never repeat themselves, but result instead from differing combinations and sequences of mechanisms with very general scope. When I interviewed Tilly, I had nominated him for an honorary degree at Michigan. So he spent the whole weekend at Dearborn. And he and I just drove around in the car and visited Dearborn and talked about social contention. Can you imagine a more wonderful opportunity than to have hours and hours with Chuck Tilley? Fantastic. But at one point I remember him saying, you know, people study civil wars as if there were a theory of civil war that they would be able to discover. But there is no general theory of civil war. There are just multiple instances of what we now classify as being civil wars. But, you know, exactly as he says in the book, or they say in the book, they result from differing combinations and sequences of mechanisms with very general scope. Or in other words, when we study civil war, whether it's you know, in whatever country, in whatever century, it's fine to begin with the classification, it's a civil war, but that's not where the explanatory work will be done. The explanatory work requires dropping down to a more meso level, a more disaggregated level, and then to identify those social mechanisms of contention and collaboration and competition, betrayal, trust. Tilly has a whole book on trust networks, that both bandits and revolutionaries require trust. So I think this sentence is, to me, the methodological meat of the book. What does it contrast with? Well, there's a study which has been going on for decades at the University of Michigan called the Correlates of War Project. I think it's still going on, the Correlates of War Project, which is a very large database of episodes that we could call wars, and then a whole big list of variables that each of these episodes has, and then the effort to discover statistically the associations, the correlates, the characteristics, which are found in the duples or the tuples, the pairs of nations which actually go to war. So the Correlates of War Project has the effort to find gross macro characteristics of countries in historical situations, which would explain the fact that war occurs in this case, but not in that case. I think the most famous finding of the Correlates of War project is that democracies do not go to war with each other. So if two countries have the characteristic of being democracy, then the probability of their going to war, England or Great Britain and the United States will not go to war, according to the Correlates of War project. Well, that's good to know.
We might just be England pretty soon, Dan.
Good point. Oh, Britain, what was that? We've forgotten what Britain is. You're right. We may go to war with Wales, though, or Scotland, I guess is more likely. Okay, so the second point I wanted to make is that, so there's the Correlates of War project, but there's also Theda Skocpol, who is well known, of course, to Tilly and McAdam and Tarot, who has a macro level comparative study of social revolutions. And her book came out, I think, in 76 or 79, something like that. It is a comparative study which depends on, and it's a causal analysis. She's interested in discovering what are the causes which give rise to the occurrence, or maybe make more likely the occurrence of the outbreak of social revolution. And I think I can show you, I think I can show you a graph. If I can find that quickly, I'll do that. She comes up frequently in my blog, but there's one post, I think, which has a nice diagram of the way that her model works. Not finding it. Okay, so I will therefore give up on that goal and will simply say that the way that it works is she has her something like, I don't know, 7 to 10 cases. Some are positive cases where revolution occurred, including France, Russia, China, and others are negative cases where social revolution could have occurred but did not occur. So that's the listing of the cases. And then she has a set of characteristics. So weak state, recent war, either success in war, failure in war, famine, social unrest among the peasantry. She's got a list of characteristics. And then she makes an assumption that the causes of social revolution are, let's just to start, let's assume that the causes of social revolution are deterministic, that whatever the causes are, when you have the conjunction of conditions which lead to social revolution, they always lead to social revolution. And if even one of them is missing, then you never get social revolution. In other words, it's not probabilistic causation, it's deterministic causation. And I could go into that more. But this then allows us to use what you could describe as being a truth table test for comparative historical sociology. You have 7 cases, and you have, let's say, 6 variables, true, false variables. Yes, there was famine. No, there was not famine. So true, false. It is possible to lay out a truth table, a finite truth table, and then to find historical instances for every line of the table, both the cases that you've got and the cases that you don't have. Under those circumstances, it's possible to demonstrate that you can discover what the conjunctions of circumstances are which bring about the outcome, social revolution in this case. It's kind of an application of Mill's methods of similarity and difference. And I could refer you to more stuff on this. But the interesting thing is that that approach also is in contradiction to Tilley, McAdam, and Tarrow. Of course, they come 20 years later. But it's in contradiction because it is all at the macro level. It's, did revolution occur? Was there a weak state? Was there a famine? Those are all macro level characteristics. And then her effort is to see which conjunctions of those macro characteristics are always associated with the occurrence of revolution. And she thinks that there is an answer, that weak state in the conjunction of recent failure in war is, that's the conjunction which leads to social revolution, something like that. Tarrow, McAdam, and Tilley, I say it differently, different order every time, I know. But their view is this is a non-starter because these cases are not that similar. And instead of having 8 characteristics, there's an indefinite list of characteristics. So there's no possibility of completing a truth table. There are indefinitely many potentially relevant characteristics. And then on top of that, we can also make the observation that assumption about deterministic causation, that's not a good assumption either. So the upshot is we have pretty good reason to think that Theda Skocpol's method is not a successful method. It doesn't mean that her analysis is not really interesting and important and a good contribution to historical sociology, but as a kind of a dispositive discovery of the causal background of social revolution, it is unsuccessful. And I think there was one last comment here. So what are the features of analysis which I'm kind of celebrating and recommending to you? It's the idea, now I'm back to talking about dynamics of contention. It's the fact that this book and this methodology is actor-centered. It is dynamic. That is, it recognizes that a social contention isn't like the explosion of a can of gasoline just all happening at once. Rather, it's an interactive process, a dynamic process. It's fluid and contingent. The instances of the episodes basically are heterogeneous. So all civil wars are not the same. All revolutions are not the same. And it involves strategic, opportunistic maneuvering by actors and groups. Those are the features which I take to be really important, really insightful in terms of being good guidance for the efforts that a PhD student who was interested in how did January 6th happen, if you wanted to analyze how the riot and uprising which occurred in Washington on January 6th, if you wanted to understand that, or if you wanted to understand how the pro-democracy demonstrations have occurred in different countries in the past 3 months, you would be well advised to take an actor-centered approach, understand this is a dynamic and fluid process, be looking for contingent conjunctions of kind of accidental stuff, and to be aware of the strategic and opportunistic maneuverings by the various actors and groups. That there's nothing mechanical, even though they're looking for mechanisms, but it's not mechanical in the sense that a clock is mechanical, just ticking away. Well, I'm pretty sure that's all I have for tonight. And I do hope that you are finding the Tilly, and by the way, I guess I have to be a little bit apologetic for how much I asked you to read of the other Tilly. I wanted you to have that exposure as background, which is, it's old, contentious politics theory, but the resource mobilization theory and the strategic deliberative nature of the contenders, all of that kind of persists. That said, when I reread the material, I thought, really, you probably spent more time on this than you felt like was justified, and I kind of have to agree. So I hereby give you permission in the future, if you feel this particular reading is not advancing my understanding very well, don't give up too early, but feel free to say, Professor Little just made another mistake there. Okay, you probably noticed that I put up paper topic suggestions. And if you want to discuss them, I'm very happy to discuss them. Stopping by the office hour is one possibility, but I'm very happy to talk outside office hours also. So, but it's probably a good idea to start thinking about what you'd like to work on. Okie doke. See you exactly a week from tonight. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks everybody.